Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Chris Wytock, the acting dean and a professor at UC Irvine School of Law, and I couldn't be more thrilled to introduce today's conversation with 2021 Nobel Prize laureate Maria Ressa. This special event is sponsored by the law school's Fair Elections and Free Speech Center and the Center on Globalization, Law, and Society. It's appropriate to hold this conversation under the umbrella of fair elections, free speech, and international law, because as it's commonly understood today, the freedom of expression is under threat worldwide. We've seen a rise not only in authoritarianism and the criminalization of everything from tweeting government criticism to reporting on corruption or acts of terrorism. We are also witness to the rise of so-called illiberal democracy, where states that are nominally democratic take steps to limit the public's access to information by crushing civil society and independent media. If with one hand governments crush independent voices, with another, they and other political actors are pushing out, often not only on social media, propaganda and lies in order to manipulate public debate and knowledge. Our guest today, Maria Ressa, has been at the forefront of efforts to counter both threats to free expression and media and the war on truth. An independent journalist and entrepreneur herself, 10 years ago, Maria started up Rappler.com, which quickly became one of the leading independent sources for news and commentary in the Philippines. Her work as a journalist based in Manila has come with a cost. The government of the Philippines under President Rodrigo Duterte has not only sought to intimidate and harass her through verbal attacks, including through the use of social media, but it has used criminal law to try to silence her. She fights these legal battles even now. She faces trumped-up charges designed to intimidate her and other journalists, and that could lead to prison. Brave as she is in the Philippines, she's not only limited herself to a domestic role. She's been a supporter of and an activist for independent media worldwide, a member of countless initiatives to promote freedom and address the rise of disinformation, to protect the truth-telling function that journalism provides in democratic society. In December, the Nobel Prize Committee awarded her and Russian journalist and editor Dmitry Muratov the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to safeguard freedom of expression. I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Professor David Kay, a friend and collaborator of Maria's, who will engage Maria in conversation and then turn to questions from you. Thank you so much, Maria. We're honored to have you join us, and thanks to all of you for attending.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. And Maria, it is so great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm thrilled to see you. Obviously, as we were saying before, I'd love to see you in person as well, and I hope that we're able to do that soon. I'm particularly glad to see you're healthy and to see your smile morning in Manila. I want to start with a memory that I have, and it's sort of to situate our discussion in a way. So we met, actually, it was almost 7 years ago at World Press Freedom Day in Riga. And I really remember this well, in part because you were just such a powerful speaker there. But also I remember, this is my specific memory, is us catching a taxi back to the airport early one morning. And you had this thing on your phone, it was Periscope. You were live streaming using Periscope onto Twitter. And I remember there was a kind of joy that you had in sharing, and it was really just the video of passing by people, on the streets of Riga. And I wonder if it sort of sets up sort of a kind of foundation for our conversation, which is, it's clear that at least early on, you saw a kind of joy in social media and a hopefulness. And I just want to take us back to that moment to start and maybe ask you, what were your early expectations, and why was it that you believed in, that you turned to social media as a tool for reporting and sharing and all of that?
Oh my gosh, David, first of all, it is so good to be here. Thank you for having me. And it's wonderful to see you, even if it's only virtually. Big hugs from here. What you forgot to tell everyone is that while I was showing that to you, I was like, already, oh my God, he is the UN special rapporteur. So I was already like, going, wait, how do I get you? How do I find you? Where could, and over the years, how you have been such a staunch supporter. Let me go back to that time period, and I still believe this today, because much as the problems are now very, very clear, it's really the excesses of the platforms, and your own book shows this, right? But this whole idea that the form of journalism was going to change. It was being forced to be more inclusive. Now, imagine if that had come hand in hand with policies that actually had the standards and ethics of journalism, i.e. the gatekeeping into the public sphere. In your book, you talked about, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as the underpinning values. But what really happened was this tech is so incredible. E.O. Wilson said it, right? It's godlike technology. But then the people who built it were so busy iterating. And then again, what was the purpose for building it? Profit. And in 2019, Shoshana Zuboff actually came up with the entire system that now made it very, very clear. Surveillance capitalism, the business model that takes our private experiences, transforms it, mines it, extracts it, and then makes that the engine that drives the algorithmic amplification, what chooses what content will get distributed. So technically, think about this, and this is the horror that dawned on me much later, is that the tech, motivated by making as much money as they can, now in charge of the public sphere, choosing algorithmic decisions that ultimately in the end prioritize the spreading of lies laced with anger and hate over facts. And these are the platforms that deliver the facts, that deliver the news. So essentially, journalists ceded responsibility, ceded the choice of which news will survive to these technology platforms that are using surveillance capitalism as a model. So anyway, but to go back to the 7 years ago, I still believe that the technology is transformative. But then I go back now to the crisis, the way a biologist, an emergent behavior scholar, E.O. Wilson, he described our crisis as our oh my gosh, the godlike technology is the third, but it's our emotions, our medieval institutions, our Paleolithic emotions, our medieval institutions, and our godlike technology. And without the standards and ethics, the values of journalism, of gatekeepers, this is the world we live in. Increased populism, but beyond populism, it's really a descent to tyranny, a descent to fascism. These are all things you chronicled. You helped us in the battle, and I'll pull out a memory, and this is the reason why I will forever be grateful to David Kay. When you're under attack, which we came, a few years after, in fact, a year, I think, after we first met. And so I just had that meeting in the airport with David where I had his number. And then we came under attack. And I had in less than 2 years, 10 arrest warrants that were filed by the government against me. When you're getting attacked like that, sometimes you don't know what right and wrong is. And David was one of he was a pillar to just say, this is wrong. This is what we can do. And David had filed an amicus brief in the cyber libel case. This case that I was convicted, a former colleague and I were convicted for June 15th, 2020. The judge took David's wonderfully written amicus brief, and there was one word that acknowledged it. Noted. So
Right.
Despite that, we still keep going.
Right. That's very nice of you to say, Maria. I mean, obviously, you're unlike most journalists in that you do the journalism. You started Rappler. I want to talk about that also, but you're also a kind of leader among journalists and a defender of journalism. And I was wondering, what was there a moment when you changed, or is there sort of a vignette or something when you saw that the online space was going to be more difficult than you expected, or rougher, or nefarious in the way that you described it in your Nobel lecture? Was there a change? Was there a moment that you saw oh, wait, something's different here?
Yeah, it was 2016. But like I'm going back over that time period now because I'm trying to understand every step of the way. But I think the first danger signals were 2014, and it was in the Ukraine, and that was when we saw it more in geopolitical power play, like where information operations literally gave you two versions of reality, what the Russians were saying and then what the Ukraine. I mean, again, Crimea was we saw like the first modern day annexation with this very, very potent thing. I was watching that. 2014 was when I was covering the Indonesian presidential elections, and we saw this kind of nostalgia for strongman rule because the world had just gotten so complex. And in Indonesia, the former son-in-law of former President Suharto, Prabowo, who almost won the elections. In India, you had Modi, who I covered in like 2004 for alleged human rights violations. He won. So 2014 was, this nostalgia for strongman rule because the world had gotten too complex. We watched the info ops, the information operations. So then what happened was tech gained more power. Many more people could see this, including Rappler. Like we created Rappler because I wanted information cascades for good. Like I looked at social network analysis because starting in 2011, we were tracking how terrorists were using social media, how they recruited people to actually blow themselves up, right? If terrorists can do that, I thought, well, why don't we, in a far more systematic manner, use information cascades for good? That's the idea behind Rappler, right? That we could actually help build institutions bottom up. The technology could help jumpstart development in a country like the Philippines. The danger signals where we saw it accelerate, and I'll look at 2015, which is when Facebook came out with instant articles, and then 2016. 2016 was, I think, when the dominoes began to fall, when it had gained enough momentum, like the tipping point, where essentially the tipping point for power happened in 2016, and it began in the Philippines with the election of Duterte. A little more than a month after that, you had Brexit, and the dominoes began to fall. The Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, I think I talked to you about this, David, Chris Wiley actually said that Cambridge Analytica and its parent company, SCL, had long operated in the Philippines, and countries like ours, Nigeria, countries in the global south, which had kind of weak law enforcement, were places where they tested these tactics of mass manipulation. And if it worked, then the word he used was they ported it over to the West. We were just the guinea pigs. You were the target. And look at the impact on the 2016 presidential elections. I think what's horrific to me is that we already know what happened in the 2016 presidential elections in the United States. You have the platforms admitting that 126 million Americans were affected, were touched by this. And yet until today, impunity reigns, right? So in my case, it's like, we're demanding an end to impunity of the killings, of the brutal drug war, of the violations of the Constitution. At the same time, we're demanding an end to impunity of technology, of Mark Zuckerberg. I put Mark Zuckerberg and Rodrigo Duterte in the same breath now, and I guess the last thing I'll say is why the Philippines? Because as of January 2021, so we should be getting the new numbers now. I haven't seen them yet. They should probably be coming out this week at the end of January. But as of January 2021, for the 6th year in a row, the Filipinos spent the most time online and on social media globally. We're literally the fruit flies. That's why we could be the experiment place. And then the other part of that, of course, is that we're America's only former colony. We were a protectorate. And we speak English. So it's, yeah, there you go. We're the guinea pigs, you're the target.
Right. It's funny you can say this with a smile. There's this kind of optimism that you bring to, because I think that, one thing I've learned from you is that you have hope that there are solutions, like that nothing is unsolvable. And I think there's a lot of darkness out there. And I know that you're working on some solutions. And I love this idea of an information cascade for good. and you're operationalizing that. Can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like? And because it seems like what your approach is, okay, this is the playing field that we have. We need to change it. We can talk about solutions too. But given the fact that this is the playing field that we're on right now, we still need to protect freedom, media freedoms, democracy. What's the approach that you're taking?
I just actually spoke last night with a wonderful author who also is extremely optimistic despite all the dark, right? Margaret Heffernan. So when I took over leadership of the largest news organization in the Philippines in 2005, there was a great book that was written by Margaret Heffernan. It's called Willful Blindness. Willful Blindness. And I actually got that book and gave it to every manager in our executive committee, because it's really how you ignore the truth at your peril. How we look away, even though we know what the problems are. And that in a way that is also built into us, into our biology. So again, here's her most recent book is called Uncharted. And I take out a phrase from that I really love. When you don't know what the solution is, action is how you search for it, right? Because in the end, we don't have a choice. This is what we live in. And I've had, it's been 6 years. So I've had 3 pillars. They're the same 3 pillars that we use to create Rappler: technology, journalism, community. On the tech part, we're building our own tech. Because there has to be a place where fact-based, evidence-based, where we can continue having thinking slow discussions, because that is what democracy is, that is what governance is, that is what journalism is. So we're going to build it, because in many ways, journalists in general have abdicated the power to tech. We've allowed the algorithms of tech. And what is algorithm? What are algorithms? I'm going to quote Kathy O'Neill here. Algorithms are opinions encoded in code. That's all it is. And that is determining what gets distributed, what gets massive reach. And so it is also, these tech platforms are now determining which news groups survive, right? So in our case, we're building our tech. We started rolling it out last year. We're rolling out communities of action now. So, and then the other part of this is work that I followed you on, which is there has to be legislation, because in general, globally, democratic governments have also abdicated responsibility. How are you protecting us, right? That needs to be very, very clear, because social media has become a behavior modification system. It's like, and we are all Pavlov's dogs. I've said this so often. It's like, I feel like Sisyphus all the time. But, the reality that we live in is that we have no facts. So if you have no facts, you can't have trust. You can't have truth. If you don't have trust, then you can't have law, right? If you don't have law, you have no democracy. That's the reality. We have elections in exactly 96 days, 96 days from today. If we don't have facts, how can we have integrity of elections? So what we decided to do, so I'll finish the pillars: tech, journalism. Journalism has to survive. We continue pushing back. And really, what makes journalists different? These standards and ethics that somehow give journalists the courage to challenge power, despite the cost to yourself, right? That is enshrined. And I wish tech platforms would take some of that, because they need to protect the public sphere. And then finally, the last part is the impact on community. When we started Rappler in 2012, the first community of action we built was around climate. The Philippines in 2013 was the 3rd most disaster-prone country in the world. So I suppose you can say things were so horrible that we just had to do something, and that's part of what we did. Now, how do we deal with the fact that it's only 96 days before elections? Well, we keep pushing for legislation. I just 2 days ago, I testified at the European Parliament. They have the EU's Democracy Action Plan has 2 draft legislation that it will adopt. It's already gone through the committees, the Digital Services Act. And I think what I like about this is the fact that they're no longer just looking at content. Because that's the hocus pocus and a sleight of hand that the tech platforms want you to look at. They want you to continue debating what someone said. This is not a freedom of speech issue. This is a freedom of reach issue. And I'm quoting a comedian, Sacha Baron Cohen, when I say that. It's a distribution issue, because right now the platforms under surveillance capitalism make more money by spreading outrage, by spreading lies, by spreading conspiracy theories. And look at the impact on democracies around the world. We've slowly crumbled. In the Philippines, not so slowly. Let me just end with what we are actually doing. We launched this in the last week of January, but we have more than 100 groups. There's almost 200 now, right? A whole of society approach in a battle for facts. Our median age in the Philippines is 23 years old. So I call this the Avengers assemble moment. If you have a superpower, bring it, right? It is literally a person to person. If you play basketball, it's a man-to-man defense. We're switching out a zone, but to be gendered is to be okay with gender, woman to woman, man-to-man defense of our democracy. It starts there. So the first layer is fact-checking. Right? For the first time, 14 news organizations in the Philippines are coming together. We are going to ramp up production of fact checks, but fact checks alone are really boring. And we already know the studies they show you that, okay, yeah, but it's still a thinking slow process, right? So how do we put the signals in for the platforms? Well, all of that content will be shared amongst each other. With the news group that does the fact check is then amplified in the second layer. It's called the mesh. And I'm taking that from, Don't Look Up, that film. Remember, the planetary defense system is a mesh that came together at the last moment. So the mesh is like almost more than 100 groups that will go from the furthest left to the furthest right. It includes human rights activists, the most radical, to the business groups, the most conservative. And in this mesh includes civil society, right? What do? We want to protect the facts. So that's the second layer. And that, in algorithmic amplification, I believe will help facts rise. And because it's person to person, you then will tell your family and friends why these facts are important. So it becomes personal. The third layer is coming off of the election integrity partnership that American academics put together for your presidential elections, except we connected it with a data pipeline to the fact-checking layer, to the journalists. And that group will be coming out with, content as well. So layer 1 and layer 3 will be content, but that is analysis, right? Just because the platforms have atomized meaning doesn't mean meaning doesn't exist. It does. So that's what our academics will do, our disinformation researchers. And the fourth layer is the most important part. These are our lawyers. And we have like the most corporate law organizations, the Integrated Bar, the Philippine Bar Association, working with the Free Legal Assistance Group, that takes the cases. And here, it has 3 goals. The first is scale, impact, and the last one, deterrence. That's important. This is what we're going to do in 96 days. So wish us luck.
Right. That's a lot of work to do in the face of what's undoubtedly a difficult election environment. And so given that, because that's an amazing approach. You're building a whole structure. So let's imagine that succeeds. Whatever success is, success meaning that you're able to have a voice in the debate and all of that. What will that say to you about the kind of regulation that you would like to see? And maybe just sticking with the DSA, the European approach. So the DSA is very focused on transparency initiatives, systemic risks, different kinds of obligations that are at a system level, as opposed to, as you said, a kind of getting into the debates over what content should be on or off the platform. Is that the right approach that you think? And if it is, why is that the right approach?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the only approach, because in the end, the old world pre-tech had its own system of checks and balances that governed our information ecosystem. And the gatekeepers, us, the journalists, were held liable. We were accountable for it, which was why the virus of lies really could be contained, right? Craziness stayed on the fringe and rarely was amplified. You could also argue the other side, which is then that also entrenched power, right? But there was a system of checks and balances because it was anchored on elections. Journalists held whatever government we people elected, and information moved at the pace of the human mind. The problem with technology now is that information moves at lightning speed. So the lies came at you. And because news organizations and civil society moved at the glacial pace of humanity, we couldn't counter the lies fast enough, right? That's why it became a behavior modification system. Now, so much of the debate since 2016 really was like a whack-a-mole game of content. I mean, literally, why was it such a big deal that former President Trump, was deplatformed? That should have happened much earlier if the gatekeepers didn't care, if they actually imposed the rules of the platform, but they didn't, right? They had their own vested interests, and they put their thumb on the scale, and that is a big thing. And I think that's why it's become so politicized. But in the end, facts are really not debatable. Your interpretation of the facts can lead to different truths, but the facts are not. And to allow the greed of the platforms to make facts debatable, I think that's the biggest problem. So in terms of legislation, I think there are two questions I want to get to. One is the DSA, and the other one is, why the Philippines? Why this kind of degradation of facts has led to historical revisionism that has led to Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the son of a former dictator, being the front runner in our elections. And his election will depend on changing the facts, right? So to go back to the DSA, let's go to the problem, to where the problem began. It is the algorithmic amplification. And these are all, under surveillance capitalism, you have all of those problems mixed together, but we rarely look at it all together. We've kind of compartmentalized it. Content moderation, as if that's the only thing, but content moderation is a downstream effect. Data privacy, that's further upstream. Antitrust, that's further upstream, right? That connects to the business. And a whole host of others, like agency, right? Because essentially, that surveillance capitalism that has built a model of each of us. Who said they should own us? Who gave that power? These are some of the questions I think you tackle in how to govern the internet. So for me, immediately right now, right, what's happened though is after these problems, and then we debate about it after Frances Haugen comes up with more than 10,000 internal Facebook pages. And it's not just Facebook, right? You're talking YouTube, for example. Brazil will have elections in November. Jair Bolsonaro was a far right voice that was brought into mainstream through YouTube, right? So these are all, I guess it's like the impact of the algorithms, of the opinions that they coded and released to the mass base globally that are optimized to keep us on site has had real impact. And the two things that I would say is that, we have to go back to the rule of law, because essentially the internet, cyberspace, the makers, the people who knew it said, well, we are cyberspace, so we need new laws. But in the end, cyberspace is the same space as the reality we lived in. So we have to find a way to make the laws that have worked, that we all abide by, also relevant to cyberspace. Cyberspace is not different, as I've found out, right? Online, that violence online is real world violence. It has an impact. And just because you don't see it immediately, I think we fell for the sleight of hand of Silicon Valley that said, we need new rules for cyberspace. I think that's completely untrue. If you were to hold people to account for what has happened, instead of having this kind of learned helplessness attitude, or worse than anything, analysis paralysis, where we will take everything and its derivative before we act, we must act now. And I think that's what the DSA does very well. It makes it transparent. The European legislators asked me about trade secrets. I mean, frankly, right now, if they're in charge of the public sphere, the same way with journalists, they don't have trade secrets. They cannot manipulate people. That should be against the law. And yet, this insidious manipulation has literally been, it's been the norm. And it's happened with impunity.
Yeah, that's really powerful, Maria. And I want to remind our participants, we have Q&A. I'll ask questions as they come up, so please feel free to ask questions. And I'm going to turn to some of those in a second. But before I do that, Maria, I wanted to ask you about, so today the news was that I think it was in Facebook's earnings report that, for the first time, the user base decreased slightly. With that and with the clear push, not just from Meta, but from others within the tech sector moving towards this metaverse idea, I wonder, as you're looking ahead, and this will be the last kind of tech question I ask, because I want to talk about media freedom issues as well. But clearly you must have some concerns. What are your concerns, and what are the things that you're thinking about as we sort of look ahead over the next probably 3 to 6, 7 years, as the internet changes, as social media changes and becomes sort of captured by this new idea of a metaverse?
When the metaverse was announced, and that these big announcements used to be real points of celebration in the past, until the excesses really made all of us wary. Rappler is still a Facebook fact-checking partner. We're one of 2 Filipino fact-checking partners. I believe that tech is important for the future. So I think 2 points there. The first is, I have since 2016 asked the tech platforms to have enlightened self-interest. It is in their self-interest to lead, not to have short-term profit at the expense of all of our futures. So that's the first one. There is a gap in leadership within tech, right? It's almost like they're all trying to make as much money as they can. And then there's, I think we need real leaders who care about the public. And please come up. Some people will say Apple did that. Well, let's see, because Apple is also creating its own advertising model. I think the biggest problem that we have is this kind of micro targeting. Again, that weaponizes our private experiences against us. Tristan Harris said that, it's like you went to a psychologist or psychiatrist and you told that person your deepest, darkest secrets. And then he or she goes out and says, hey, I've got David's worst secret. How much will you pay me for it? That's kind of what's happening. So that's the first is, please, Silicon Valley needs these are American companies that are wrecking democracies. I mean, in case we didn't notice, and the values, live by your values, enlightened self-interest. The fact that, I guess the second part of that is, why should we trust these companies until they show us that they can be trusted? They can no longer hide behind the old things of this is all new, because it's not. It's now 6 years in. As of January last year, at least 81 countries around the world, cheap armies on social media, rolled back democracy. 81 countries around the world. We know for sure, for example, that, and this is both the UN sent a team into Myanmar before the coup happened. Marzuki Darusman, and the former Indonesian head of the Commission on Human Rights, led that team. And then Facebook sent its own team. We know genocide was enabled by Facebook in Myanmar. And again, that has happened with impunity, right? So it's time to act. It's time to lead. Instead of they've done this, talk to the hand. Instead of doing that, why don't you say, here, this is what's happened, and this is what we are going to do. You'll still make enough money, but it's called leadership. Yo.
Yeah. Right. Yo, you got to end it with the yo. Kirsten Hahn asked a question here. I think we both know Kirsten, who's a fantastic journalist in Singapore and faces a lot of the same kinds of threats that you face. And she raises this question of, we have this debate. It's often a debate, in Europe and the United States, or North America and Europe, but it's worldwide, about sort of democratic control of the internet and regulation that is based on democratic ideas. But she raises this concern, which is, we've seen, for example, the Germans adopting their Network Enforcement Act, which, has certain problems with it. But one of the problems is its use by authoritarians in order to say, look, you want to regulate the internet, you want to localize data, you want to do X, Y, and Z, why can't we do it? Or, and part of that is disingenuous and in bad faith, but still it's sort of offering ideas. And I think Singapore is a decent example of that happening, because Singapore really jumped on the fake news bandwagon and adopted some laws that are really quite awful for journalists and freedom of expression more generally. So what's the, how do we protect, how do you both promote the democratic but also not provide tools to the anti-democratic?
First, I think 3 steps, right? The first step is that to stop analysis paralysis and actually put democratic principles. This is why I look at the EU, and we look at some of the beacons, quote, in quotes, the beacons of democracy, to put these in place. Because if you don't, then you open the floodgates, right? And that's actually what's happened, because it's been 6 years. So that's the first is, let's control the tech, the algorithms of amplification, the surveillance capitalism model. That is business. That is capitalism. Control it at that level before you get to freedom of speech issues. And how do you control it at that level? Like transparency, right? At the EU right now, they're debating whether or not, aside from academics, NGOs should be given access to data. And I'm a journalist, and we had access to the data. But it's ironic that after Cambridge Analytica, essentially Facebook shut down to the point that you can't even scrape the data. In fact, the NYU researchers who were doing crowdsourcing of the ads that you were getting, Facebook shut that down. They don't want anyone else to know what is happening on their platform. And that is untenable to democracies all around the world. So the first step is, this is going to be an iterative process, as iterative as the destruction of democracy, right? Inaction is not an option, because people like me, you're perpetuating the injustice, right? So for example, let's talk about every platform where that you report. What about all those millions of people who have reported harm and the platforms took no action? Isn't that unjust? You can look at, my 10 arrest warrants, the fact that I could go to jail. All of this was enabled by social media platforms. Isn't that unjust that you maintain the same conditions that allow lies to spread faster and further than facts, that allow meta-narratives that call me a criminal when all I've been doing is to be a journalist? I think that's the first. Iterative solutions. Yes, GDPR network, that very long German phrase was flawed, that GDPR came on, and now you have the EU. That's 3 iterations. That's not bad. And the woman who is the rapporteur for DSA is actually from Germany, right? So in that sense, please, inaction is not an option. The second one is, if you don't act, then illiberal governments will come in, because this is truly a problem. It's not just a problem for journalists, it's a problem for businesses. And that's normally when you'll get the most action. There's so much fraud that is allowed, right? And then it goes directly to elections. So I guess those are the 3 things. We're dealing with the byproduct of inaction. This is an untenable place. And I think this year is a critical year, because you have key elections in many countries around the world. I think the Philippines is May 9th. You have Hungary kicking in. You have Kenya. You have Brazil will have its elections. France will have elections. And then Brazil's elections is in October. And then, hello, America, you have elections. We need to find immediate solutions. And I guess in the Nobel lecture, I called for a global David, you asked for this in your book, right? This is like the atom bomb exploded, and we must look at it with that same kind of urgency, because every day of inaction leads to another day of injustice.
So I want to move to, because we've got about 20 minutes left, and I want to make sure we address a couple things that are also very close to home for you. I mean, this has all been close to home for you, but as you've mentioned, you've been subject to 10 different arrest warrants in the Philippines, and and you face this cyber libel criminal conviction. Where do things stand right now? And I guess the question that I'm curious about is, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the global support that you've had, because it has been global support, and how that has had an impact on the situation in the Philippines. Because from the outside, it seems like the Duterte government is just sort of inured to the outside pressure, and yet that outside pressure has to be done, and it's important, and you have amazing supporters. What does that look like? So I guess first part of it is just, what's your situation right now, and the second part is, what do you need from the international sort of community of activists and governments to basically say to the government, you've got to stop this harassment?
There's so many ways to answer it, but they're all interconnected, right? So the first part is really where activism belongs as a journalist. And to me, it became very clear when I was arrested the first time. That was actually a critical moment for me, because I knew I didn't have to ask anyone else whether their rights were violated. My rights were violated. So I think the first step is realizing that when it's a battle for facts, journalism is activism. We talked about this a lot, right? It is a battle for facts. And then when that happened, where do you turn? In a country like the Philippines, when we were targeted by the government tried to shut us down in January 2018. They revoked our license to operate. We immediately fought back, because it was so, I guess we were still in the old world where the checks and balances worked. And our lawyers reminded me of this, but Chai Hofilenya and I, my co-founder, actually immediately we released a statement. We forgot to run it by our lawyers. And then we did a press conference that night, despite what our lawyers told us, because our lawyers told us, you have to let us study this. And I was like, no, this is so egregious. So we, and Chai and I didn't actually have time to even discuss what our talking points were. When we held the press conference in our office, we had a little sheet on top of us, and we just put bullet points of what we each wanted to talk about, and they were aligned because they were values driven, mission driven. Okay, so the first step is that our defense actually came from each of the four founders' strengths. My co-founders are deeply anchored and embedded in the Philippines. We have two of them came from an independent news magazine that was more than a decade old before we essentially brought them into Rappler. And then the other two of us are TV people. So my other co-founder actually ran all the newscasts for the largest broadcaster in the Philippines. And what we did is we went to our strengths. And I speak English. If I spoke Tagalog, ganito ang mga Tagalog ko, my Tagalog is like my Indonesian. It's learned. It's not innate to who I am. I'm an English speaker. I grew up outside. Most of my career until the last decade of Rappler was outside. I spent 20 years with CNN. And so when all of this was happening, that's what I did. I called on the people I knew who knew my work. I called on people like you who I met in airports, because this was so unjust, so wrong, with a pattern and trend that was so clear, was global in scope. And I think what I tried to do that gave me meaning, look, I'm getting emotional, was to sound the alarm, because it's horrifying. And it worked. So #HoldTheLine Coalition. While we continue doing the journalism in the Philippines, we continue doing hard-hitting reporting. Because the main thing that you don't want is for you to self-censor. So my co-founders made sure we did that, but people in the Philippines were afraid. People outside, not so afraid. So the Hold the Line Coalition, which included so many, almost 80, more than 80 media freedom and news organizations around the world, helped us survive.
Yeah, it's amazing. And the people who stood up, I mean, are really amazing people. You know, one of the so the founding of Rappler is remarkable in many respects, but it's also, I think people need to understand, it's also basically women run and founded. And there's something about also the moment, and I don't think it's only a social media moment, but the threats to women journalists in particular seems different. It seems, I mean, much of the critique, much of the venom that is thrown at journalists is different when it's thrown at women as opposed to men. And I wonder, I mean, is that something that you see also? And what's the response to that? I mean, what should we be doing in order? I mean, partly it's what social media, but it's a broader social problem as well.
It is, but it is sparked by technology again, right? It's like someone like President Duterte, former President Trump, a lot of other leaders like them have given people the license to be their worst selves. And part of the reason they do that is because their message gets broader amplification on social media, right? And they get greater, I hate the word engagement now, but so that is encoded in the very platforms that deliver the facts. That is our primary modes of communication. I think the first thing is that women, LGBTQ, and I included this in the Nobel lecture, gendered disinformation is at a scale that we've not lived through because it is enabled by technology. UNESCO came out with something called the Chilling for World Press Freedom Day last year. And they showed, in my case, for example, Julie Passetti and her researchers came out with they analyzed almost 500,000 social media attack posts, and 60% were meant to tear down my credibility, Rappler's credibility. 40% were meant to tear down my spirit. And I'm going to, the other case study that they looked at is Carol Cadwalader. So presumably Global South, Global North, right? So, but think about it like this. It's not just journalists, it's women in general, because gender disinformation spreads fastest and further. So it's aside from the journalists, women politicians. This is Madeleine Albright and the NDI is in their 5th year of trying to encourage, because what it's doing is it is forcing women out of journalism and out of politics. And that will have massive repercussion in our societies, in governance. So that's the first. Yes, if you were already marginalized before technology came along, you are further marginalized. LGBTQ, GLAAD has come out with its social media guidelines, right? And I think that aside from demanding better, we really need to form communities of action. I think the last part of this, which connects to your earlier question, is that action today has massive ripple effects. And this goes back to what I'm saying, that inaction is not an option, because right now, what we don't have is justice, but it's slowly coming for the Duterte administration. The International Criminal Court, for example, is opened an investigation into, the first casualty in our battle for facts is how many people have actually been killed in this very brutal drug war, because we watched in plain sight as the numbers were shrunk, back to like pre-2017 numbers, the official numbers. This is like, again, this willful blindness, right? Because if you call it out, you can be attacked. So justice will come. But then the last part of this is when the platforms take action, the ripple is in the real world. And a perfect example is the most recent one. In December 29th last year, just the end of last year, I just tweeted an old story that was a study of how Ferdinand Marcos's Jr., his diploma at Oxford, was lobbied. The Marcos government lobbied for this diploma because he didn't finish the full year. He didn't have a full diploma. They created a special diploma for him. And he was caught in a lie, right? So I retweeted this old story because it was in between Christmas and New Year. And then the next day, pow, I was clobbered by attacks on Twitter. And it was a spike. So I then pulled it out and I could see the spike. It was unnatural. And that made me want to go. Our team then went to look at, all right, all these accounts are all kind of brand new. They were formed at the end of last year. So we took the pro-Marcos hashtags and the anti-Marcos hashtags and just compared their creation dates, which are all data that's very easily available. And what we could see was the difference. The ones that were pro-Marcos all had one massive spike. The ones who were against him were all over, right? It was like the normal bell curve in many instances. There wasn't even a bell curve because there's a difference in the patterns of a real consensus online versus manufactured consensus. And then what happened? We published a story. Right after we published that story, a few days later, Twitter came back and took down 300 accounts. When they did that, all of a sudden the attacks stopped because, it is an arms race that all of a sudden the attacks, the information operations needed to recalibrate, but it also did something to the people who were fighting for facts. It gave them renewed energy. So this is how our future is created step by step.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and before then, did you ask Twitter to take action and they didn't take action? Or, they must have seen exactly what you saw.
Yeah, so this is kind of what's nice, right? I know in the United States, they're different, but in the Philippines, Facebook has been the least proactive in terms of, and I say this with great love as a fact-checking partner, but the reason we became fact-checking partners of Facebook is because when we find the lie, we look at the networks that spread the lies, right? Twitter has been proactive in the same way it was proactive with taking down and labeling Trump's tweets, taking him off platform. As you can see, which platforms. We can look at their track record now. Who is proactively looking for a solution versus who is really trying to keep their finger in the dam before it comes crashing down? I don't understand that strategy at all.
Yeah. Let me ask before, because we'll probably need to wind down shortly. You started your Nobel lecture by zooming out globally. It was a global lecture, and I really encourage everybody to read it or to listen to it because the video is there. But you started by referencing all of the journalists. Obviously not all the journalists, but so many of the journalists who you had worked with, who many of us have known over the years, who've been killed, and of course others who've been detained unlawfully, who've been subject to all sorts of attack, and clearly the Nobel Committee, at least in part, was looking to that situation, the fact that we have a crisis of attack on journalists, even apart from the social media side, that is really, a threat to democracy, to fair elections. What's to be done there? What is it? There's obviously a need for accountability at the domestic level, but what is it that we need to be doing internationally to stem this? It's already been, I think, 4 journalists killed in Mexico just this year. So in less than a month. What's missing? What should we be doing? What's the answer to solve that just terrible problem?
I think first is just realizing they're connected, right? So, and that's the reason why we're trying to attack it at every front, because there is the impact, the journalists who have been killed, but the erosion of democracy, that astroturfing that led to the impunity of killing journalists. Part of the reason it's increased is because think about the online hate against journalists as fertilizer, right? And then your populist leader, your authoritarian leader just comes in and harvests the crop that grows on that kind of ground. You seed a lie, You seed a meta-narrative, perfect example of Stop the Steal. That's a meta-narrative that was seeded a year earlier. So in our case, journalist equals criminal, journalist should be killed. How many times do you hear that where you then think the same thing, right? This is a virus of lies that infects real people. When real people are infected, that's an increased destruction of democracy, because their worldviews change, the way they vote changes, the way they speak, the spark of anger and hate, right? This is so the first step is I look at it first as stop this, stop the poison, stop the virus of lies, so that we can get some sense of equilibrium where our old laws can begin to work. But because right now that is exponentially increasing impunity in the real world and the threats to all journalists all around the world. I mean, come on, David, Ryanair, how can a government go and take a plane and force it to land for a journalist? At the time of the Nobel lecture, a journalist I knew in the Philippines who worked on the drug war for Reuters was killed. And the government, without a smile, said, oh, it has nothing to do with his work as a journalist. The lies are just, you can't tell fact from fiction. All right, so that's the first step. We have to do that. And then the second step is, where are you countries that believe in democracy, right? And maybe sometimes I give you too much of a free pass because it's so easy to see the virus of lies impacting all of us. I feel it. Our democracies feel it. But for too long, countries that believe in these democratic values have been a little too silent. And we were together in London in July of 2019, where the Defend Media Freedom Summit was launched. The US's absence was conspicuous. It was Canada, the UK, and it was Canada and the UK leading it, right? This year it'll be in. So I guess the old dangers haven't gone away. They've gotten worse. But the reason why impunity has gotten stronger is because people's minds have been manipulated to accept it. And I guess that's the other part, right? It's this learned helplessness. It's this fact that, there's a coronavirus and I lost my job and I can't think about this, but they are all connected. Mm-hmm. So we need to protect our journalists.
Yeah. I mean, so as maybe just last question, because we've only got like a minute and a half or so, but and first of all, thank you so much, Maria, for spending time with us today. It's really wonderful to just hear your perspective and your energy. Give us a positive thing that's happening out there. I know that you're involved in different initiatives to support independent media. Is there something out there that gives you a little bit of hope that maybe the tide is turning, maybe not just on lies and truth and all that, but on the protection of and really the support for and the celebration of independent media? Because there are a lot of people who celebrate it. What's something we can grab onto as a positive as we wish you the rest of your day?
Well, it's people like you. It is. So I also thought about this in the Nobel lecture. I talked about the good, right? Because in many instances, I am taking a leap of faith. I believe in the good. I believe people are basically good. And that the information ecosystem that we have created, where the platforms are pushing out the worst of humanity, encouraging the worst of humanity. I always say it's like, that old cartoon where there's a devil and an angel and the person's conscience needs to kick in and the devil is telling your ear, you get this, get angry. And then there's the angel saying, oh, but, well, our information ecosystem has not only gagged the angel, it's kicked it off our shoulders and it's given the devil a megaphone directly into our nervous system. So I don't think that's who we are as people. I think every single instance, look at history. Again, World War II is an interesting example, right? I just hope we don't do it too late. we come together. The miracles of our humanity come from those instances when we come together. And I feel like we know impunity has happened and that people will come out. So I get hope from two ways. I look at the communities like in the Philippines in the middle of the pandemic, where there was no hope, no aid for ordinary people. At that point, more than 4 million Filipinos in the capital region had lost their jobs. So what happened? One woman, young woman, she's like in her 20s, just decided to set up a community pantry in her neighborhood. Anyone who had excess food, put it here. And
Maria, thanks so much. It's so inspiring to hear from you. And really just want to thank you. And also to, I think something you know is that there's a world of solidarity with you, with what you're fighting in the Philippines, and also with your cause of, global media freedom, freedom online, and a fight for truth. So congratulations on the Nobel Prize. It was an award incredibly well deserved. And I look forward to seeing you hopefully in person sometime this year. But thanks so much for spending time with us.
No, thank you for all your work, David. And I look forward to working with you again. And you guys read his book, The Speech Police. It's a great, easy read that gives kind of like a primer on the things we need to do. But all of this stuff, I think, is like we tend to think it's outside of us. I think what we need to stop is learned helplessness. We need to start with our neighborhoods, start with our areas of influence. We have to do it now. And thank you for having me, David.
Thanks, Maria. Take care.